harbingers continue. The mystery advances. That's what happened with ancient Israel. They're warnings, they're foreshadows. And if the nation does not turn back to God, they must continue. The shaking must continue. The escalating judgment must continue. That's exactly what happened to Israel. The attack came, the attack was over, and they took the normalcy, or what looked like normalcy, to be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. It was a period that God gave them to choose him or to defy him and go to judgment. So here the mysteries of the harbingers are going to continue, and they're going to produce a second American calamity. The Isaiah 9:10 effect. There's going to be a second shaking. You have 9/11, it touched America militarily, and you're going to have a second shaking that's going to touch America in its economic power, its financial foundation. The mystery of ancient Israel is now going to replay in modern America. And so what happens is the campaign to strengthen America's security requires massive expenditures. Massive government expenditures on the war on terror produce skyrocketing debt over the American economy.
That's the fear that the world's largest economy, the US, has finally lost control of its debt.
At all these things, which will hurt America, it'll be another manifestation of this Isaiah 9:10 effect that's going to bring about the collapse of the American economy. And it happened just a few days after 9/11. It was 6 days after the attack. The government, the Federal Reserve, is worried that 9/11 is going to collapse the economy there because it's already weakened, and so they're afraid of it hemorrhaging. So on that Monday after 9/11, the Federal Reserve takes its first action. It's actually, in a sense, America's first action of "we will rebuild."
The Federal Reserve has cut interest rates once again. It was a move that many had expected to come sometime today. The central bank lowered the overnight benchmark half a percentage point to 3%, and this is the 8th rate cut this year. Now, again, the cuts were widely expected as the central bank has been seeking to keep funds flowing through the economy and also boost consumer confidence.
It starts an extreme slashing of the nation's interest rates, and it goes on. It hits 1.75 in December, just a few months later. It forces the interest rate below inflation. The extreme rates open up an era of easy money. It causes unprecedented borrowing and lending, credit bubbles, housing bubbles. The stock market surges. The effect spreads around the globe. The credit explosion leads to an explosion of debt, and standard cautions that people would have are discarded. Banks discard caution. They get involved in risky practices, increasingly making loans they would never make, investments they never would make. Personal debt, government debt, corporate debt, all mushrooms, and this is the Isaiah 9:10 effect. It creates an economic house of cards, and it all goes back to 9/11. It all goes back to the dusts of 9/11. And in September 2008, the effect comes to full force, and the economy, the American economy, crashes, the greatest economic disaster since the Great Depression. And it goes back to this biblical principle. And here a commentary saying this: divine anger, being a remedial force or corrective force, will not cease until its purposes are wrought out. If one expression is resisted, another must be found.
Everything there completely wiped out. And the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
The Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement, and I don't blame them. The credit market...
676 points down.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
This collapse that comes on the American economy weakens the American economy and hastens the end of the era of America's reign over the economic global order. And God gave a command to Israel called the Shemitah, or the 7th year, or the Sabbath year command. 6 years you will sow your field, and 6 years you'll prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath. So in the Shemitah, or the 7th year, the Sabbath year, all laboring on the land stopped, all sowing, all reaping, all harvesting, all the fruits were abandoned. On the last day, Elul 29, anyone who had a debt had to release it, or anyone who lent something, it was gone. Loans, credit, the nation's financial accounts were wiped away. The Shemitah was meant to be a blessing. But if the nation turned away from God, the Shemitah turns from a blessing to a judgment, to a sign of judgment. In Israel's history, the people would be driven from the land and the land would rest. And God said, now the land is going to keep its Sabbaths or Shemitahs. And so Israel was in captivity or exile for 70 years. Why? It was based on how many Shemitahs they had not observed. So the Shemitah also holds the key to the timing of the judgment on a nation. When did the economic collapse of America happen? This is the second shaking. It happened 7 years after the first shaking. It happened 7 years after 9/11. So if you didn't have 9/11, this would not have happened. That means even 9/11 is woven into the mystery, an ancient, ancient mystery of the Shemitah. When America was commemorating 9/11, the 7th anniversary, the second calamity was already beginning on Wall Street. And what happened? Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Other companies went bankrupt. Debts and loans were wiped away. Financial accounts were wiped away. Shemitah, the bankruptcies, Shemitah, bailouts, foreclosures, Shemitah, nationalizations, crashes, swept over the world. It was a colossal Shemitah wiping out of financial accounts. So when was the peak of the financial collapse? It happened at the end of September in 2008. It was the greatest stock market crash in the history of Wall Street. And so when did this greatest crash take place? It took place on the 29th day of the month of Elul, on the exact biblical day specifically ordained to touch a nation's financial accounts. It took place on the exact biblical day that is a judgment to the nation that has driven God out of its life.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Two-year note yields went from 190 to 166 in the blink of an eye.
I have never live looked at the Dow Jones Industrial Board and seen a 600-point loss.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
And it marked the end of a 7-year period, and the key number of the Shemitah is 7. And so how much of Wall Street was wiped out that day? 7%. How many points exactly were dropped? 777.
Can't look at it after you buy it. It's so horrible.
And that was an end of a 7-year cycle. So there should be another event 7 years before that began it in the financial realm. The first crash took place on September 17, 2001, the greatest stock market crash in history up to that time. And it would keep that record for 7 years. So right there, you have the Shemitah. You have a 7-year period beginning with the greatest crash and ending with the greatest crash on September 29, 2008.
There is a little bit of a consternation down here about there being no bell. Our market reporters are standing by. Bob Pisani, have you ever seen anything like no bell?
Yeah, that's a little strange here.
Because the opening bell of Wall Street wouldn't sound. People took it as a bad omen. But what date was September 17th on the Hebrew calendar? And the answer is stunning. September 17, 2001 was also the 29th day of Elul, the day when a nation's financial accounts are wiped away. So the two greatest stock market point crashes in the history of Wall Street up to that date happened on the exact, both of them, on the exact biblical day ordained to touch a nation's financial realm. Exactly 7 Hebrew years apart. It's mind-boggling.